Welcome back, everyone. This is our first Fantasy Labs NHL show of the year. We're going to break things down into a four-part series in which we will highlight each team from every division. And going into the 2017 and 2018 NHL season, I'm your host, Joe Holka, joined as always by Sean Newsham at PSUFans2 on Twitter. And Sean, you ready to dive back into this, man?
Yeah, I mean, it's been so long since we talked about it. I'm glad we can get back in here and go to the next division and hammer this out. So, yeah, we're ready to finish off the Eastern Conference here.
Great time of the year. Hockey's going to just get rolling here. We're going to have football and hockey, so not a lot of better things and a lot of better times in DFS. Also joining us again is Ryan Sheppard at DonkShowDFS on Twitter. Ryan, you ready to do this?
Yeah, I'm just happy to be talking hockey again.
Yeah, it's great. Let's just jump right into it. We've got a lot more to cover today. Finishing off the Eastern Conference, this time the Metropolitan Division. So we're going to start with the Hurricanes. They definitely set the tone for their offseason when they acquired goaltender Scott Darling with the trade from the Chicago Blackhawks. So I think that's a really big move for them. Darling was going to become an unrestricted free agent July 1st, but he failed to qualify for the Stanley Cup playoffs for the 8th consecutive season. The Hurricanes just weren't willing to kind of go through another season with what they had in net. So they signed him a 4-year deal, $16.6 million right after the season. So I think that's pretty interesting. Tons of transactions for this team. Sean, does anything else stand out outside of the Darling trade?
They brought Justin Williams. I think the plan is he's been there before, I believe, as well, with his brother. I think it wasn't his brother there as well, Jason, way back in the day. I could be wrong on that.
It's been a while since he was there.
But so anyways, they brought him back in, and I think the plan is to play him on the top line, which I just don't think he's good enough to be playing a top line position anymore, even really a top two line. I thought his role with Washington last year was a very good role for him and fit him well. And I just don't think he's got enough left to still be doing what he needs to do on the top line. This team is just a weird team. They just have a bunch of pieces that are okay. No one's terrible, but so I like their depth. Their third line is actually a pretty strong line, but their top line is relatively weak. But yeah, for the most part, outside of what you mentioned with Scott Darling, they brought in Trevor Van Riemsdyk from Chicago as well, and I kind of like Van Riemsdyk. I think that if he could possibly eat some minutes for them, he could be a solid player for them. So it really all depends where they sort of end up finishing with how their lines will show up throughout the season.
Yeah, so they give up a second-rounder for Van Riemsdyk, I believe, and they also get a seventh-round pick as well. So that's an interesting one. I still think Darling is kind of the big story here. Ryan, do you think that he has what it takes to be a full-time number one goaltender?
I mean, he put up numbers in Chicago, and he put up numbers in Chicago when they were kind of starting to take a little bit of a dip. I do like what he can do. I know they're obviously hoping that Darling will do what Cam Talbot did when he, after being groomed as the backup in New York, and then really taking the next step forward. They've been kind of riding the Cam reward train for a while, and he just kind of just floated along, and I never understood why they kept bringing him back. And then obviously Eddie Lack was never worked out. I think he can. I wouldn't expect him to start, 65, 70 games, but if they can give him, 50, 55 games, let Cam Ward be the backup, I think the tandem could work. Carolina's been a team that I've been kind of waiting to take a next step for 2 or 3 years now. Looking up and down their forwards, it looks like they're going to be rolling out, 3 second lines. They don't really Jeff Skinner. He's a goal scorer. He's had injuries in the past, but I think they definitely have some offense. But again, they don't really have that superstar. I know last year I used Carolina a lot in DFS, but they changed their lines up so much, and it's very frustrating. A lot of times, you're just looking last minute to see what they're going to roll out. Their team's young, their defense. You're looking at the oldest defenseman, Trevor Van Riemsdyk, at 26 years old. So a lot of it's going to depend on, does Noah Hannafin take the next step? Does Justin Falk's obviously their offensive guy, but he struggles in his own end. A lot of it's going to depend on how their youth takes the next step this season, and I think they could do it. I think they can surprise some people.
Yeah, I mean, goal scoring was definitely an issue. They averaged 2.5 goals per game last year. Skinner had 37, led the way. Sebastian Aho had 24, but those are the only guys that had more than 20 goals last year. So I think it's interesting. It's kind of, we'll see where the goal scoring kind of goes to. I think Teravainen's interesting. He scored 15 last year. Might be a little bit more comfortable this year. But yeah, I mean, I think Justin Falk is extremely underrated. The one thing that I don't like about Falk is he doesn't really block any shots. He's a guy that's featured on the power play, has probably one of the best one-timers in the league, but when we're kind of looking for those peripherals, he's one of those guys that's not going to block a ton. So, Sean, is there anything else that kind of stands out from this team, or do you think it's just going to be guys maybe we're targeting for shot volume but not a ton of goals as far as upside?
Yeah, so Ryan sort of alluded to this, and this is something I just want to bring in, and this is pretty much the perfect team. So when we played DFS, a lot of the time you want to play guys like Brent Burns, Erik Karlsson, Connor McDavid, which is great because they're obviously elite players. But the big keys to winning in DFS is finding teams like this. Because what happens is that throughout the entire year, Carolina doesn't really get massive ownership because they're not the best team in the league. But you have a team that, like, let's say when they play a very weak team, they can go out there and skate with them and take shots. Jeff Skinner had 37 goals last year. I don't know if his price tag on any of the sites ever got near what a 37-goal scorer should get. So if you can sort of pay attention to teams like Carolina, find out what they do, find out who plays with who, what they do together, it's a good thing to know because, like, for example, last year, I think some of my better days were when, like, Aho was playing with Teravainen and Stempniak, and they were 4K each every night. Well, if they played an elite team in the league, okay, great, then I don't have to use them. But you get a game where they play a very poor team and all these guys are 4K. It's guys you can plug in that correlate well together, that can score goals, that allow you to get in guys like Brent Burns and Erik Karlsson and Connor McDavid of the world. So teams like these, the middling type teams, the bottom tier teams, are important to know things like this so that you can sort of monitor that as the season goes and get them in good situations to open up salary for other players.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point. The Hurricanes were a team we targeted quite a bit last year for a lot of the reasons you just outlined. I mean, they were all pretty cheap. Was frustrating at times that they were changing their lines so much. So we've kind of been priding ourselves on getting that information out the fastest. So make sure you guys kind of keep up to date with our lines page and our goalies page. But this was a frustrating team as far as that. But there's still an edge there too. Like if people are kind of making their lineups earlier in the day and don't realize that certain pairings are going to be either that certain lines have shuffled. I think this was a team where you found a lot of value last year because of their price tags and because of their shot volume. So I think it's a team that just in general, I think that finding teams like this, like you said, is extremely important to be able to pay up for those studs. So is there anything else you have for the Hurricanes, Ryan?
Actually, there's just something I was going to say. I think Carolina is a team that might be interesting to target at the beginning of the season because they don't really have, a strong number one line or, a superstar forward. They're kind of like the opposite of like a brand name player. Like they're a team that nobody's going to be going out of their way. Like, I can't wait to roster Elias Lindholm this season. Like they're a team that has three balanced lines that nobody is going to be looking forward to using. They're all going to be looking for, Pittsburgh, Washington, all the other, high superstar teams that they're always the team that I end up pairing with, the top line that's expensive because they'll have their top line is going to be, 4,200, 4,200, 4,300. So I think they're going to fly under the radar at the beginning, no matter how good they are, just because they're not a team that people are looking forward to using.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. Really good analysis there. Moving on, let's talk about the Blue Jackets. They're a team that made the playoffs last year, but they're going to try and make the playoffs in back-to-back seasons for the first time in their history. So they're bringing back decent remaining of their core, but with one significant deal. So they brought in Anton Panarin, and then they actually sent Brandon Saad back to Chicago. Couple other complementary pieces in that deal. Sean, what was your initial thoughts when you saw that Saad was going back to Chicago and then Panarin was going to be a Blue Jacket?
My initial thoughts on that deal, I actually thought it was a really interesting deal. And my thoughts are that Chicago knows what they're doing. So here's the thing. Saad spent multiple years in Chicago, And then he left because they didn't want to pay him the money. And then Panarin came in. And then Panarin got paid a very similar salary to what Sod's is, if I remember correctly.
Mm.
So the thing is if they got rid of Sod because of what he was making, got in Panarin, and then once Panarin made that money, they decided to move him for someone they already know. It's a situation where they spent 3 years with Sod, they spent 3 years with Panarin. There's probably a good idea that they are correct in this trade because they've had experience with both of these players. So I still think Artemi Panarin's a really solid player, but I think that Chicago had the most knowledge in the situation because they've had experience with both of these players. So I think it's a situation where Chicago probably is going to end up winning this trade, but both of these guys should put up good stat lines for both of their respective teams now because they're both solid players and they're going to be playing with good players as well.
Ryan, how much can we downgrade Panarin not playing with Kane this year?
I think you're going to have to downgrade him. I mean, when you lose one of the best players in the game on your opposite side, I think you definitely have to get downgraded. And I'm very curious to see what he does in Columbus. I mean, they have some interesting players, but they don't have anyone anywhere near the caliber of Patrick Kane. Like it's almost going to be like Panarin's going to have to be carrying his line, and I don't know if he's capable of doing that. Well, at least anywhere near the level he had been. So I honestly don't know what to expect. I know when the trade first happened, my initial instinct was I liked it for Columbus. I'm like, Panarin, 75, 80 points, great player. And then you start to really think about it. Brandon Saad is one of the most complete players in the game. He does it all, whereas Panarin is pure offense and has probably been benefiting way too much from Patrick Kane. So I agree with Sean that I think Chicago knew exactly what they were doing, and I think this might be a trade that Columbus looks back on and regrets.
Yeah, I love the trade for Chicago. I think Brandon Saad is extremely underrated. He's a guy that's performed in the playoffs for them before, and especially these last couple of years where they haven't kind of gone as far as they would have liked to. I think picking up a piece like that, and instead of just keep hanging on to a piece like Panarin, who, I mean, he can be pretty perimeter at times, and that's really not how you win in the playoffs. I think he's a very good player. I think it's harder than people think to play with a guy like Patrick Kane and be successful. But, I mean, this team's already made it known that they need another stud. Like, they went out and tried to get Matt Duchene in the offseason and failed. So I think there's a reason to believe that Panarin could struggle, and we'll see what his salary is like to start the year. But I think that if people want to kind of just play him on name value, I'll probably be fading that to start the year. So let's talk about Sergei Pavelski, guy that obviously had an extremely poor postseason performance, but was very good during the year. He led the NHL in goals against average, and then his save percentage as well. Won the Vezina Trophy. So, Sean, do you think that he's a guy that can bounce back after that postseason performance, or is he someone that is going to be more of a regular season goalie, which is fine for DFS purposes, but it's still a little bit concerning that he played so poorly?
I think he should be able to rebound. I think the team in front of him is good enough that he should be able to rebound a decent amount. The thing is with the playoffs is it was such a small sample, and by that point of the year, it's one of those things in sports, peaking early or peaking at certain times during the year. Columbus peaked in the middle of the season. They hit their high notes, and then from then on, it was sort of a decline. Now, granted, you have the same pieces. It's just all how things are clicking. So I just think that it was just sort of a situation where he just sort of wasn't clicking at that time of the year. But I think he's obviously one of the better goalies in the league, and the team in front of him is good enough that he should be able to rebound nicely.
I tend to agree. I mean, getting the Penguins in the first round was probably a rough draw for them, a team that's definitely had a lot of success in the playoffs. A lot of those players have a lot of definitely experience in the playoffs, and that was something they were probably lacking. As far as experience, Zach Werenski, do you think that he's one of those players that could have a sophomore slump this year, Ryan, or do you really like what you saw from him last year at age 19?
I definitely loved what I saw from him last year. As the season went on, I believe he slowed down for a little bit in the middle and then kind of picked it back up at the end. So I think that really showed that he can handle the 82 games. I think that he's going to take another step forward this year. I mean, well, he got 47 points last year, so I don't know how much of a step forward he can take offensively, but I think they're going to look for him to, round out his game a little bit more, because he looked absolutely phenomenal at some points last year, and it was fun to watch. I don't think he takes much of a step back, if any.
Yeah, I agree. He's a guy that's extremely poised. What I like most about him, and what I think kind of gives him his value in DFS, is that he's really just not afraid to make mistakes. Like, he's not kind of one of those guys that, I think he's smart enough to correct his mistakes, but he's not afraid to go out there and make plays. And that's just huge for a player that's a young player coming into the league. There's tons of guys that perform well in juniors, perform well in college, get to the pro level, and they are just scared to make plays. But I think it makes a lot of sense to kind of praise him, I guess, for how well he played when he was 19. Sean, what are your thoughts on Werenski before we move on?
Yeah, I think that I would expect him, sort of what Ryan said, I expect him to round out his game a little bit more. His offensive upside is still there, but they're going to expect him to pick up more of a role defensively this year. This team's really strong at the back. Like, Seth Jones is a really good defender defensively too. So I think with those two guys at the back, they're set for quite a long time, and they have two really solid young guys.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I think that's a team that has a chance to get back to the playoffs. They've got some holes, but they still have a ton of depth. We can't forget what they did last season on that big winning streak. So I think they're a team that could probably take a step forward, if anything. So moving on, the New Jersey Devils. They're a team that had the number 1 overall pick last year. Sean, you're going to have to tell me how to pronounce his name. But, they have some veterans on their team as well. Brian Boyle is one of the guys they added. They added Marcus Johansson in a trade. So I think their offense could definitely take a step. Let's hope. It's a team that was not very good last year. Sean, what do you think of the new number 1 overall pick?
Well, it's going to be interesting because I absolutely hate the Devils. This is just a team in the league that I just can never stand. They've always used to play a boring style, and it just, I don't know. They're just not anything good. Now, that said, you're going to have that top line with Taylor Hall, and I'm not even sure how to pronounce it either myself. It's like Nico Hischier.
There you go,
Hischier. Okay, so you're going to have Hischier and you're going to have Taylor Hall, and you're going to have these guys on the top line with probably Kyle Palmieri. That could be a pretty good line. The problem is after that, this team is complete nothingness. But we know Taylor Hall shoots the puck. We know Taylor Hall produces points. We know that Kyle Palmieri shoots the puck and can produce points. If these guys come in and maybe you get decent matchups for them, this could be a line maybe you look at a little bit, because they'll probably be underpriced because they're going to be on the Devils, who, by all accounts, if you look at this roster, is going to be one of the worst teams in the league. I mean, they don't have anybody that's any good outside of like those couple guys. Like, they brought in Marcus Johansson, who I just am not a fan of because he doesn't shoot the puck, he doesn't put the puck on net. They just have a bunch of mediocrity, not even mediocrity. This team is just not very good. So you're going to have a team that's probably going to be one of the worst, if not the worst teams in the league. But you could have a top line that if it clicks well with a talented rookie like that, it could be a really good spot to find value all the time with guys that can produce.
Yeah, I mean, obviously he's the number 1 pick for a reason. He was a guy that was extremely productive in juniors, played in Halifax in the QMJHL last year. Pretty elite talent from a little bit I've seen of him on tape. And I think one thing that kind of goes understated, at least as far as the offseason, is kind of the loss of Travis Zajac to start the year. The guy that's going to miss the first 4 months of the season after having surgery to repair a left pectoral muscle that he tore. So, I mean, he's missed 20 games in the last 5 seasons. He's a guy that eats a lot of minutes, plays almost 20 minutes a night, and he wins a lot of faceoffs. So I think that can kind of go understated. I mean, he was one of the best faceoff guys in the league. He's won at least 50% in his last 10 seasons, which is extremely impressive as far as you're looking for a team that's going to possess the puck. So what do you think about the number 1 overall pick, Ryan, and then kind of the loss of Zajac as we kind of circle back to that?
Nico Hischier has looked actually really good in the preseason. He's got a couple nice goals. It looks like there was talk kind of in the summer that, he wasn't necessarily a lock, which is pretty surprising for a first overall pick. But I think he's at least put most of that doubts behind him because he looks really good. their center depth is definitely going to take a hit. I mean, it wasn't that strong to begin with, but with Zajac out, they're going to have obviously Hischier, who's a rookie, Zaka, who's barely played any time in the NHL, and then Adam Henrique. Mm-hmm. So I mean, that's really weak down the middle. I know last year, like you guys were saying, the Devils, they would stack their top line from time to time, and because they had done so poorly, they did make for great salary relief, and I feel like that might be the case again this year. If they end up having, Hischier, Holland, Palmieri, or Zajac at center, or Henrique, if they stack the top line, I can see them being useful, but if they try at all to spread out some of their offense, I think it's just going to have 3 anchor lines that are all useless. They look like they're in big trouble this year.
Whatever line Taylor Hall is on is a line that you can at least consider because of his talent level and what he does. After that, they're just completely garbage, honestly.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, from what I've seen in the preseason, I depending on who he starts the season with, I might throw out the odd Hischier line stack. But I mean, it's ugly. It doesn't look good for New Jersey this year. I'd be shocked if they finished anywhere but 30th or 31st.
Sean, talk to me about Cory Schneider. He's a guy that's kind of he had probably career lows last year from what I'm looking at here, but I mean, he's a guy that was pretty productive in a limited role in Vancouver. So what do you think about Cory Schneider this year? Is it just a matter of the team in front of him isn't very good, so he's not going to get a lot of wins for us in DFS, or is the shot volume he's going to see make him intriguing at times?
Yeah, I mean, this team stinks. He could see a decent amount of shot output, but I mean, you had a decent sample from last season where they just weren't good, and his numbers for the most part weren't great. So it's definitely like when I would talk about Cory Schneider's downfalls from last year and carry him into this year, I'm blaming the team more than him. But that said, I mean, it's still at the end, he's at the back end and he's got to make saves, and if he's not making them, it's going to be blamed on him. So I think he gets way too much of the blame, and it's more the team's fault than his. But he's definitely not someone that I would expect to win very many games this year.
Agreed. I think we've spent enough time on the Devils. Let's move on to the Islanders. So the Islanders kind of didn't waste much time this year. They really wanted to upgrade that top line. They went out and got Jordan Eberle in a trade, and then they traded Ryan Strome. I don't know. I'm not a big fan of the trade in general. I think he's getting paid too much for kind of what he's done in his time in Edmonton. He's obviously got the World Juniors pedigree, played with John Tavares quite a bit over the years for Team Canada. I mean, Eberle scored 20 goals 5 times in his NHL career, but I mean, his contract's an annual value of $6 million a year. I don't know if he's a $6 million player. Tell me I'm wrong, Sean.
I mean, I would put it this way. Patrick Marleau's getting paid more than that. I'd probably rather have Jordan Eberle. I really like Jordan Eberle. I know his stats aren't the best from with what he was in Edmonton, but I think he has the potential still to produce a good stat line. And with playing with John Tavares, that could – the thing with Eberle is they paired him with Nugent Hopkins in Edmonton. He didn't really get the playing time with McDavid to flourish or anything. If he comes in and gets the playing time with John Tavares and it's not battled at all, and he gets those minutes and he gets top power play line minutes and he plays top minutes every night, I think he could really flourish with John Tavares. I think he needed a change of scenery, and him getting into a new lineup and a new team could do him wonders. And I really like Tavares. You might be right. He might not be a $6 million player, but I think he has the potential to be a $6 million player.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's fine. I think there's a reason that Edmonton was down on him. They tried to trade him last year at the deadline. They really wanted to add a defenseman and get that salary off the books. Know that for a fact. So Ryan, break the tie. What's your thoughts on Eberle with this team as a $6 million player? What do you break the tie here?
I mean, I guess it depends on what you expect for $6 million nowadays. Like, he's put up 20-plus goals in 4 straight years. I know he only put up 51 points last year, but I could see him getting back to 25 goals and 60 points playing along John Tavares. I mean, Tavares has really become a much more well-rounded player, so I think that's going to help with Jordan Eberle. When he was playing with Nugent Hopkins, that line was all offense all the time, and I think that would struggle And it's an upgrade to play with Tavares. Unless you're playing with McDavid on Edmonton, Tavares is going to be an upgrade on any other player that's there. So I think he's going to get 25 goals and 60 points again, and I do like the trade a lot for the Islanders. I think it's definitely a way for Eberle to rejuvenate his offensive output.
Correct. And for me, Strome is a much better player. Eberle is a much better player than Ryan Strome. My bad. Let's make sure I got that right. But Jordan Eberle is a much better player. Granted, he's going to have the higher price tag, but he fits what they needed. And if, like Ryan said, Tavares is an upgrade. Unless you're playing with Connor McDavid, there's not many players in the league that are going to be an upgrade to play with over John Tavares.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, Tavares is a guy that's entering the final season of a contract, and he was making just on average $5.5 million a year. So, I mean, he's been eligible to sign that extension since July 1st, and it still hasn't happened. Do you think that's going to be a little bit of a distraction, or you don't think that it really bothers those guys kind of keep things separate?
I mean,
No, go ahead, Ryan.
I was just going to say, as a Toronto fan, I talked about was Stamkos. So, I mean, I know for me living in Toronto, I'll be hearing about it all the time, and he's going to be asked about it all year long in New York. I mean, not necessarily if he's going to be going to Toronto, but I'm sure they're going to be asking about the contract. And the longer it goes, he might say it's not a distraction. We'll see what the numbers say as the season goes on. But if people keep asking him about it, it's going to always be on his mind whether he knows what he's going to do or not. So I can't see a player like that coming to the season without an extension. I can't see it not being a distraction, to be honest.
Yeah, I could see that. What were you going to say about it, Sean?
No, I was just going to say pretty similar stuff to what Ryan just said on it.
Yeah. Right on. Well, what are you guys' thoughts about this Pulak kid? He was a first-round pick, number 15 overall. He's basically just a power play specialist. He's a right-handed shot on the back end. I think that he's got a chance to crack this lineup that's kind of weak on the back end as far as their skill guys. So do you think he's going to be able to emerge as a top 4 defenseman, or is he going to spend some time in the American League?
I think that there's definitely the possibility that he emerges. Outside of Nick Leddy, they don't really move the puck that well on the back end. So it's definitely the possibility. I know last year they were never happy with Nick Leddy. They were never happy with Johnny Boychuk on the power play. So power play specialists are always valuable pieces because the difference between a good power play point man and someone that can create there and not is drastic on your power play and the percentage that you can put up. So if it's something that he could flourish in and he takes to, it's definitely a situation he could find himself in that role early and carry throughout the year.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I think that another really interesting storyline for this team is Jaroslav Halak. He's a guy that cleared waivers and then was ultimately demoted down to Bridgeport in the A. But then he came back and won his last 5 starts for the Islanders and nearly helped them clinch a playoff berth last year. So do you think that Halak can kind of reclaim that number 1 goaltending job, Ryan?
It's going to be interesting. I personally think Thomas Greiss is a little bit better of a goaltender. Not that that's saying much when you're comparing him with Jaroslav Halak. Mm-hmm. But like you said, down the stretch, Greiss really struggled and Halak really started to pick it back up again. I don't know if, being sent to the AHL kind of made him wake up, but I haven't followed it too much in the preseason to see how the battle's going. But I think it's going to be one of those situations where no goalie starts more than 45 games barring injury or some, complete breakout. It's going to be, pretty full swing tandem all year, I would imagine.
Yeah, for sure. All right, well, we got quite a few teams still to go through here, so let's move on to the Rangers. They're definitely a team that's motivated. I think after what happened to them in the playoffs, kind of a bitter end to their season, losing to Ottawa in 6 games in the second round, but it's a series they probably could have won. They won games 2 and game 5, or they were leading both of those games and then lost each of them in overtime. So definitely probably ended the season with kind of a poor taste in their mouth. They went out and signed Kevin Shattenkirk, which doesn't make a lot of sense for a team that struggled in the playoffs, to me at least. And then they also let Derek Stepan go, who was with the Coyotes now, but they picked up Anthony DeAngelo and a first-round pick. So what are your thoughts there, Sean, on some of the movement that they've, as kind of some of the signings they've had and transactions?
Yeah, I don't love it, honestly. I like their roster. I think their roster has a lot of talent on it. I love Kevin Shattenkirk. I've been a fan of Shattenkirk's for years. I wanted him to end up in Buffalo, but obviously he wanted to be in New York for a while. But their defensive puck movement should be really good with Shattenkirk. The problem for me is with the departure of Derek Stepan, your second line center, I guess, is going to be JT Miller and stuff, but I mean, if you end up having to play like Kevin Hayes is terrible. If you end up having to play Kevin Hayes in like a top six role, it's not great. Whereas Derek Stepan was a good player. So it's definitely a situation of like, I think they are weaker than they were up front, but the addition of Kevin Shattenkirk is a massive addition for them and gives them the power play quarterback that they desperately need. Because I don't think that Ryan McDonough does a good enough job that Kevin Shattenkirk can come in and take that over.
Yeah, I mean, I think Zibanejad probably slides into that number one center role. They're paying him $5.35 million per year. He's on a 5-year deal, so he's probably the guy they expect to take that spot. I don't think Kevin Hayes is terrible. I think he's more of a role player that needs someone to get him the puck. At least that's what he was like in college. I think he was in a really good spot last year just playing on the third line. That's probably where his ceiling is. I don't know if he's really a top six type forward, so I would definitely agree with you there. Stepan's a big loss. He's a guy that's averaged 55 points in the past 4 seasons, and he's someone that played in all situations, took a lot of faceoffs, and both Zibanejad and Hayes have never reached 55 points in the NHL. So I think there's a lot to be said for just the loss of Stepan. I'm not really sure they added enough goal scoring or point scoring to kind of make that kind of something not that we need to worry about. Ryan, what are your thoughts on Stepan in general? Do you think that that's going to be a pretty big loss for this team?
Yeah, I think it's definitely going to hurt. I mean, you went from having pretty good center depth to looking like you have pretty weak center depth. I mean, Zibanejad, he's pretty good. I mean, but relying on him as your number one center is going to be trouble, I think. I mean, he's probably going to play alongside Chris Kreider, who's someone that I love. I like his goal scoring touch, his speed. He's a really good player, but like we've been talking about, I don't understand when people try so hard to find all these centermen, and then now all we're talking about is teams that have traded away their center depth without really getting much upgrading at all. Mm-hmm. And back to Shattenkirk, that signing, I mean, we knew it was going to happen. It had been rumored all year long that he wanted to go to New York. He wanted to sign his big contract, but in the playoffs against the Leafs, Washington sheltered him. He was essentially a power play specialist. He played barely any even strength minutes. He looked terrible at even strength. And then they went and signed him to a $6.65 million contract for how many years? 4 years, 5 years?
4 years, yep.
Like, I don't understand. Like, what do they see that apparently nobody else sees? I think it's going to be a contract that they might regret as early as this year, because he's, for a guy that puts up the offense that he does, he's not worth $6 million. Like, there's a reason St. Louis had no problem getting rid of him.
It's such a Rangers signing too. I feel like they always have like a splash in free agency. Like Kevin Shattenkirk, I don't know. They definitely, I mean, they wanted him out of St. Louis. Things didn't work out in Washington. I don't know. I think that he's a guy we can target in DFS just because he's good offensively, but from a real hockey perspective, he's not someone that I think he's pretty overrated, to be honest. Anything else on the Rangers, Sean, before we move on?
No, that's about it. I definitely agree with Ryan. We've talked about a lot of teams that are just trading away their center depth. Like they trade away Derek Stepan for a first, but the problem is like the New York Rangers are in win now mode. What are they doing trading someone like Stepan away for a first and Ryan D'Angelo, who's a young puck-moving defenseman? It just is a weird situation to me, and it doesn't make much sense because your center depth was very solid. You had 2 very good centers, and now all of a sudden you have one, and I mean Zibanejad, like Ryan said, Zibanejad's a very good player. He's very solid. Would I be fine with Zibanejad as my number one center? Maybe I'd be okay with it. But if I had Derek Stepan and Zibanejad, I'm very comfortable. My top 2 centers are very strong. Now you look down the middle of their roster, and it's they went from a win now team to a team that now has a hole at center, which is something they didn't have. Why? So it just baffles me that they'd be doing something like that.
Yeah, it doesn't make a ton of sense. I mean, you look at some of the best teams in the league. Pittsburgh obviously comes to mind, but there's just so many of the elite teams in the league that have center depth, and then some of the teams that are struggling are just kind of trading their weapons away. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Let's move on to Philadelphia. This is a team that's definitely rebuilding. They've got a ton of young players that they feel are kind of ready to take that next step. They've made a few kind of transactions. They traded away Braden Shen to St. Louis, and a couple other kind of other smaller deals. But I think the big thing is they locked up Shane Gostisbehere, who I think has kind of the talent to be one of the best defensemen in the league eventually. They locked him up for 6 years. He's a guy that is extremely gifted skater, and offensively, Sean, you played a lot of Shane Gostisbehere last year.
Yeah, the problem with Gostisbehere is they kept like benching him and just completely scratching him from the line because of his defensive deficiencies. And this goes back to the Shattenkirk thing we just talked about. Mm-hmm. If you're that good offensively, teams need to realize, and this goes back years to the Erik Karlsson debate, people would equate the fact that the guy is very good offensively but has defensive lapses as an issue. But the problem is the guy makes up so much more with his offensive ability. It makes up for his defensive lapses, not the other way around. So they would end up scratching Shane Gostisbehere to get some of these other bums in their lineup, and it's just something that doesn't need to be happening. So he's someone, I agree with you. I think his offensive talents are elite, and his power play work is very good. They just need to let him – you need to grow with someone like that. Like, you're one of the worst teams in the league. Let this guy go out there and make some mistakes defensively and let him grow as a player. So I just want to see this team let him go out there and play and not have to worry about making a defensive error and getting withdrawn from the lineup or losing his minutes. So he's definitely someone I want to see this year, and I think he's a great player.
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely the kind of player that needs to be able to go out there and make mistakes. He's a young kid. Didn't really understand them scratching him a couple of times last year either. One thing that was interesting, I remember looking at his splits last year, is he was quite a bit better at home, which makes a lot of sense when you think about what kind of player he was. I mean, he didn't have to play a lot of defensive zone faceoffs because he had last change at home. They were able to get him out there for pretty much every offensive zone draw, which is something that I think we could see a bit more of this year. But, I mean, they're paying him so much. I think if they just kind of use him in that offensive role, he could be someone that we'd really want to target in DFS. So, yeah, Ryan, what are your thoughts on Gostisbehere? Is there anyone else that kind of stands out as one of the top targets on this team that you kind of see yourself playing?
Yeah, so the Gostisbehere argument, it feels like a lot of the stuff that I was trying to defend Mike Green about 6, 7, 8 years ago is a lot of people gave him crap for playing his defensive end, but the problem was he never spent any time there. Like, his puck-moving ability and his skating ability kept the puck in the offensive zone so often that – okay, maybe his, the amount of time spent in the defensive end versus the amount of mistakes he made was probably high, but he wasn't back there very often. So I think it's an issue that gets overblown because everyone expects their defensemen to be perfect at both ends of the ice. In terms of the forwards, there's actually a relatively interesting stat that was brought to my attention a couple of days ago. So the 4 of the top 5 players in power play time on ice per game last year were on the Flyers power play unit. They ride their top power play unit very heavily. Gostisbehere was first, Shen second, Giroux third, Simmons fifth, and then Voracek was 10th in the league in power play time on ice. So, I mean, that spot for Braden Shen is likely going to be filled by Travis Konechny, and I think he might be someone that you can get value at the beginning of the year. With that, I think it's obviously tough to predict, how many power plays you're going to get in a game, but they're a full power play unit for tournaments that I think are worth stacking because they rely on it so heavily. And you could see the top unit out there, for a minute and a half, some games on one power play. And I think that's something that is definitely worth looking into because they rely on them so heavily. I also think Wayne Simmons is one of the more underrated goal scorers in the league. He's put up 28 or more goals in 4 straight seasons, and I don't think many people realize that. He's just been very consistent. I think maybe because he doesn't get the high point totals, people don't realize, but he just, on the power play, he gets the dirty goals. He gets the hacking and slashing in front of the net, and he's definitely a guy that I roster a lot because of his goal scoring ability, and he's a lot of times underowned when you look up some of the offensive point totals that Giroux and Voracek have had. People like to sway to them a little bit more.
Yeah, I think the power play was definitely a huge thing for them last year. They scored 25.9% of their goals on the man advantage. So you mentioned Brayden Schenn. I honestly think that Jordan Weal is going to be the guy that steps up there. He's someone that I think could definitely kind of go into that role. Weal had 7 even-strength goals in 23 games last year. That was only one fewer than Schenn had in 79 games. So, I mean, Weal was a guy that was absolutely elite in the American League. He won a Calder Cup with Manchester a few years ago. I think he's a guy that definitely has the talent to do more. He's definitely more of a top 6 type player. He's not very big, but I think that he could kind of eat some of those minutes. Sean, is there like one of these prospects or at least one of these younger guys that you think is going to step up? It seems like they have a lot of young talent. It's just really, we're not quite sure who's going to kind of step up yet.
Yeah, no, honestly, I like the Jordan Weal take. That's sort of where I would lean to. I think that both Konechny and Weal are the two that you're looking for that offensive punch here. Someone's going to fill that role, and whoever that person is going to be pretty valuable because they're going to be underpriced for at least the beginning of the season. I think it could be a decent amount of different people, though, so you're going to have to keep an eye on that. But Jordan Weal is someone like you said, Joe. He dominated in the A. He's been a goal scorer before. He takes shots. If you see him on a top line or a top role, he's definitely someone that could produce good value for on a given night.
Yeah, I mean, he was a guy that we looked at last year, like as soon as he got called up, and that's one thing we talked about during the year last year. Like there's so many people that like don't want to take a shot on these guys coming up from the American League, but there's tons of times where these guys see a lot of run. They come up and they play power play minutes right away, and sometimes they're guys that are extremely productive in the American League. So I think that's one thing you can kind of research on your own and see if some of these guys, some of these call-ups are guys that shoot the puck a lot, guys that could have a significant role. I think that's a pretty big edge to be able to fit in some of those studs that we want to play. Let's move on. Let's talk a little bit about the Pittsburgh Penguins. Obviously, they're trying to become the first NHL team to three-peat since the New York Islanders won 4 straight from 1980 to 1983. So, I mean, they lost a few key players, Crosby, Malkin, a year older, but definitely talk about centerman depth. I think they're going to be just fine, but they did lose Nick Bonino, which I think is an underrated type of player, at least role player for them, was a big part of their 2 Stanley Cup victories. So, Sean, does Bonino stand out as the biggest guy that they lost as far as their transactions, or do you think there's someone else that they probably would have lost as well that was a big deal?
No, without question, I think that was the biggest loss. Nick Bonino is a really strong player, and having him as your third-line center, and then especially like whenever you have an injury to someone else and he could pop up to the top 2 lines, like Nick Bonino is a very valuable player, and he'll definitely be the one they miss the most. Outside of that, honestly, I think it benefits them. Losing Fleury so you don't have to pay him all the money he was making is fine. You can let Murray actually take over the team. You brought in Niemi for like nothing. I think that's a great thing. I think that Chris Kunitz being off the books is a great thing. Kunitz kept getting on lines. He just hasn't been the productive player he is because he's a bit older now, but he was good friends with all those guys. So like they would jam him on Crosby's line where you have younger guys that could fill that role for a cheaper price and be more effective. So honestly, I think some of the stuff they did to clear people out is going to make them better in the long run, which is scary because they've won back-to-back championships.
Yeah, it's really scary. They did lose Matt Cullen as well, St. Cloud State alum, so big fan of his. Anyways, they had a ton of young guys. They actually kind of locked up a few of them. Connor Shiri, Josh Archibald. They're going to have Kensal back for another year. It's really too bad Kensal wasn't on his contract last year. They probably wouldn't have been able to afford him. So that's big for them to get him back as well. So what are your thoughts, Ryan, on Chris Letang? We know that he had that neck surgery at the end of last year to repair that herniated disc. Do you have any concerns with him coming back? Do you think that it's even scarier that they won without him last year? Now they might have him back.
That's actually exactly what I was going to say. I think that the fact they won the cup without Letang and now he's coming back and we've seen what he can do on the ice. I mean, obviously coming back from neck surgery is going to be, I'm sure it's going to be an adjustment, but he's used to coming back from injuries and he finds a way to bounce back to being one of the best offensive puck-moving defensemen in the league. So I know I wouldn't be surprised if he comes out of the gate a little bit slow, but if he's just stayed in shape, then I don't think it's going to be that big of an issue. They lost Bonino, but their center depth's going to be down a little bit. But I still think they have 3 solid lines. The one thing I'm going to be interested to see is obviously Jake Gensel in the playoffs was, one of the biggest surprises, putting up 13 goals and 21 points in their playoff run. And then he had 33 points in 40 games in the regular season. Playing along Sidney Crosby, he looked good. Obviously you're going to have some inflated numbers playing with Crosby, but I don't think he really looked out of place anytime I watched him. And obviously, when they're going to the Cup Finals, I was watching a lot of Penguins games. The one that disappeared in the playoffs who put up solid regular season numbers was Connor Shiri. Again, someone that was mostly benefiting from playing with Crosby. It's going to be interesting to see how these 2 guys do this season. They both shown that they can put up numbers with Crosby, but everyone can. Kensal obviously looked great again last year. His best time was when he was spent actually playing with Bonino. So it's going to be interesting to see how he does this year. Obviously if the consolation prize is Evgeny Malkin, whoop-de-doo. But even in Toronto, his best time was playing with Bozak. He really thrives when he's the guy carrying the puck into the zone. He's the guy running the line. So I would play him on the 3rd line with Bums because I think he does way better in that situation where he can just come down the wing, rifle off a shot. And that's just,
You're so nice the way you talk about Kensal. He needs a guy that's going to go into the corners because he refuses to do so. Was such a good pairing with him. That's why he's done so well with a guy like Bozak who competes. I really like Kensal in DFS, but as a normal hockey player, he's so frustrating to watch. Can we talk about how nice it was just to play Gensel for a month straight because they just refused to raise his salary? How awesome was that last year, Sean? We played him for a month, every single night.
They did the same thing with Shiri. It was Gensel and Shiri were just not priced at all. So you just played them all the time, and it was just
they're 60% owned and 40% of people are wrong.
It was great. No, I'm all for it. I think I'm with Ryan on that. I think Gensel and Shiri. The thing is the reason Pittsburgh wasn't winning the championships over the course of Crosby's career was a couple things. Fleury would be a head case in the playoffs, and all these guys couldn't perform next to Crosby. If you can't perform next to a guy like Sidney Crosby, you have issues. You'd have guys like Bo Bennett and those guys not perform. Connor Shiri and Jake Gensel came up and performed. They might not be the best players themselves, but if they can go out there and perform next to Sidney Crosby, that's all Pittsburgh needs them to do. So it's definitely a situation going into this year where you're going to see these same guys on his wings again this year, and they're going to perform again, I would assume.
Hey, there will be no Bo Bennett hate on this podcast, former Penticton V. Gensel, I think it's harder to play with a guy like Crosby than you realize. Gensel was never an elite guy in college, but he's always one of those guys that has elite hockey sense, and that matters so much when playing with a guy like Crosby because you can just find those soft areas, and I think that's kind of underrated. You really don't have to be an elite player, but if you have an elite hockey mind, I think that really matters when playing with a guy like him. I think Murray is really interesting. He's a guy that's never played more than 49 games in regular season, but I'm not really worried about that. I think he's unquestionably one of the best young goaltenders in the league, so he's a guy we'll probably be playing a lot of this year. You guys ready to move on to Washington, the last team?
Yeah, sure.
Yep.
All right, so Washington, same kind of story with them. They're a team that's disappointed in the playoffs. They won the President's Trophy for the 2nd consecutive season. Now people are starting to say that maybe their time has kind of come and gone. Is there reason to believe that they've kind of missed their window, Sean?
I don't think so. It's just, so what happens in the NHL is everything is dictated on the playoffs. So if you don't perform in the playoffs, you're just not going to be considered anything. The thing is Washington's always very good in the regular season. They draw poor, they end up with a bad draw or something in the playoff, or something just doesn't go wrong for them, and they just are looked at as losers. Alexander Ovechkin is not a loser. This guy wants to win very bad. And you can see what he's done over the last few years to change his game and improve himself. I wouldn't say that their time has passed because I think that they still have enough talent on the roster to compete, but it's definitely a little bit thinner the deeper you go down their depth chart. And they really needed a guy like Dmitry Orlov to like step up and be a top line defenseman. If they could get some guys on the back end become elite defenders, I think Washington could they're going to be in the situation again where they're going to need to perform come the playoffs. But I mean, they didn't really lose tons of guys that were huge, in my opinion. They had like Justin Williams and he produced, and they had Marcus Johansson, he produced. But I don't think those are the reasons they were producing. Those are just complimentary guys that were okay players. You're going to need someone like Andrei Burakovsky to step up. You're going to need like Jacob Verana to step up. You're going to need Orlov to step up. It's all going to depend on what guys like that can do, because you know you're going to get out of Nicky Backstrom. You know you're going to get out of Ovechkin. You need these other guys to step up and give them more depth to perform at that level that they need to be successful when it comes to playoff time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Orlov was probably the weakest link, at least in the playoffs of that group that you were talking about. If anything, Nate Schmidt looked a lot better in playoffs, I think, than Orlov did, and he obviously was chosen in the expansion draft, so he is not returning. Ovechkin had 3 consecutive 50-goal seasons, but had just 33 last year. So that's his lowest output since 2010. So I don't know if OV has kind of if maybe that was the outlier season, but it still is concerning to me. He's a guy that doesn't play defense. We know that. It doesn't really matter for DFS. So I think there's time to take some shots on Ovechkin, but he's priced up so high. Like typically we're paying up for guys like Brent Burns that give us a little bit more. So Ryan, what are your thoughts on this team in general? Do you think that, I mean, they definitely paid TJ Oshie. Do you think that this top line is kind of the one we're going to want to attack and that's basically it? Or do you think there's a little bit more depth?
I was, first of all, shocked that they ended up signing TJ Oshie. I couldn't believe that they were able to fit the cap in. I mean, I know they traded Marcus Johansson, but I thought for sure there was no way Oshie was coming back. So they've got a lot of expensive players, and they are definitely treating it as this year, next year. You know, they have to win now. They're going all in, loading up at the top end of their roster. It's going to be interesting. So Jacob Verana has been playing with Ovechkin and Kuznetsov a little bit in the preseason, and if he can stick on that top line, he's the guy that might be cheap or will definitely be cheap to open up the season. And then if they have Burakovsky, Backstrom, and Oshie as the other line, that's an extremely top-heavy top 6 when you look at the rest of the roster. I mean, they seem to win the President's Trophy every year. They're going to be a top 2 team in the East. I can't see them falling back, but it could be this year or next year where they do start to see the decline, because Ovechkin dropping that far in the goal department is a little concerning. I don't know. I don't know if it's just a blip on the radar for him. He's 32. He is getting up there. I hope it's not the decline because he is such a fun player to watch, but I don't know. It's going to be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. I think Burakovsky is one of the keys to this team. I mean, he's only 22 years old, but he's been so inconsistent. I think the talent's there for sure. Is there anyone else you want to keep an eye on, Sean, at least early in the season? Maybe someone that could be a little bit underpriced?
No, I think what you said with Jacob Verana, that's going to be the guy, because what they want to do is they want to break up. They do not want to play Nicholas Backstrom, Oshie, and Ovechkin together. They've made that clear last year that they do not want to do that. So they want to play Ovechkin with Kuznetsov, which means somebody's going to be on the other wing. And then the other thing is you look at the second line, Nicky Backstrom would rather set up situations. He'd rather set up players. So if you put Burakovsky on that wing, Burakovsky's going to get set up more often because Nicky Backstrom is going to be creating for him. So those two guys, if they're playing on the opposites of these talented line, like Ryan said, a lot of the teams in the league have a very strong top line that don't have a great second line. This team has a lot of top-end talent in those top 2 lines. If you put Jacob Verana with Alexander Ovechkin and Kuznetsov, then you have Burakovsky with the other 2. If you get in a matchup where the other team has a weak second line, Washington's second line could be a really good spot to produce, because they're a very elite and talented line with good goal scoring ability and good players that they could go out there and really produce in those situations.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. So guys, we're running a little bit over here. Let's get your favorites to win the division. We'll start with Ryan this time.
Coming off the cup, I think Pittsburgh's going to win the division. I mean, that's a pretty easy pick. I think Washington kind of started to run away with it last year, but I think they might take a little bit of a step back, and I think Pittsburgh's going to be coming in just as stronger with Letang coming back to full strength. Hopefully Murray can last for 55, 60 starts, depending on how much they want to put Anthony Niemi back there. But I think I'm going to go with the layup and take the Penguins.
John?
I'm actually going to go Caps. Like Ryan said, what do the Caps do? They win President's trophies. It's just a matter of what after that they do that's the issue. I think they still have another couple years. I think they're getting closer to the downslope with Ovechkin, but I think they have another couple years. So I think that the Capitals will win the division again.
Yeah, I think the Caps are going to win the division. I think Pittsburgh's got a very good chance of three-peating. They just have guys that are proven winners, and that's exactly what Washington doesn't have. There's a bunch of guys that I don't think are ever going to really get over the hump. We'll see. I'm not that I wouldn't like to see those guys win eventually, but I think that it's kind of it's very telling on what's happened to them every single year with that pretty same core that they've had for quite a while. So I think we can go ahead and end it there for the Metro division. Like I said before, if you guys aren't following Sean on Twitter, be sure and do that at PSUFans2. Ryan is at DongShowDFS, and you can find myself at Joe Holka. And thanks for hanging out with us again, guys.